Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our special council meeting for Wednesday, November the 1st, 2023. I'll call the meeting to order at 5 p.m. First item on the agenda, under agenda item 1.1, Land Acknowledgement. The town of Coaldale acknowledges that we are gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot peoples of the Canadian Plains and pays respect to the Blackfoot peoples past, present, and future, while recognizing their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. The town of Coaldale is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Next item on the agenda, under agenda item 1.2, Conflict of Interest Declaration, Pecuniary and Non-pecuniary. Are there any in the room this afternoon? None declared. Thank you. Moving on to the acceptance of the agenda, under agenda item 2.1, are there any additions, deletions to the agenda? Seeing none, could I get someone to make a motion that council adopt the special council meeting agenda for November 1st, 2023 as presented? Councillor Pickering makes that motion. Any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Carried unanimously. Thank you. Going down the agenda to new business, under agenda item 8.1, we have the 2024 budget deliberations, and our presenter this afternoon is our Chief Financial Officer and Deputy CAO, Kyle Beauchamp. Kyle, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks and good evening, Council. So we do have the second budget meeting of the year for 2024. Budget meeting we will be talking about today is largely focused on capital. So when we kind of put this capital presentation together, one of the things that kind of stood out to me, this theory of marginal gains, if you've ever heard of it, right? It's the theory if you kind of improve 1% every day or 1% at discretion of time, you'll see that those accumulated gains trend to be quite significant over a long period of time. And the reason I'm kind of showing that is we're going to talk about some areas of funding, fleet, and other capital in which we're proposing increases that will help us maintain our level of service that over a short period of time, they may be smaller, but over a longer period of time, the availability that we're going to be able to have to invest in maintaining the community will be quite significant if you kind of follow this theory of marginal gains. So the first item that we're going to talk about today is the fleet and the heavy equipment. So part of this budget presentation, we've broken it down into various categories, and so we're going to kind of hit each category at once just to make things a little smoother. So when you talk about fleet and heavy equipment, we generally break this down into 5 areas within our municipal budget. So the first one is operations, so the heavy equipment there, followed by parks and recreation, bylaw, our municipal vehicle fleet, and fire and emergency services. So each of these streams that we're talking about here, they're currently all funded through municipal tax support and reserves. So we're not using any amounts from debenture funding or grants to supplement these purchases currently. And some of the challenges that we've noted when looking at this budget is the inflationary and the cost increases for the fleet, and these various equipment have been quite significantly higher than even other general construction projects that we've seen. And there's also a long product wait time available for this equipment. So we may order something early next year, but may not be here for up to 3 years. So there are also challenges that we have to consider that do affect the supply-demand economics that currently are not in the favor of the town of Coaldale. But to offset those challenges, we do have some opportunities available. Our fleet is relatively healthy in the aspect we don't have significant backlogs that we're trying to fill. We do have items scheduled for replacement, but again, we don't have a mass deficit, I guess, of equipment needing to be purchased. And again, we're also using our current annual tax funding to support these. So it reduces our reliance on other funding streams, such as grants and debentures, that council does have at their option for other capital projects to alleviate some funding there. Proposed part of the fleet and heavy equipment is a 10% year-over-year funding increase for the tax support that would be required to maintain the level of service and the equipment required here. Part of this too is we're estimating the future value of this equipment now and 10 years out. So we're doing kind of our best guess here on what the cost of this equipment is going to be in 10 years, 5 years, 3 years, and the level of funding that is required for this. Some alternatives that council can consider to a proposed year-over-year increase to the 10% is that we can transition away from tax support dollars and utilize more of our capital grants, such as Canada Community Building Fund, in the future LGFF. Those can be allocated toward these projects as well. Just keep in mind though, if we do decide to go down that road, it does reduce available funding for other capital projects available in the town. So this is just kind of a quick summary of the 5 departments I've gone through. And what we have here from left to right is the actual funding that we've committed on a yearly basis for these capital reserves. And follow that is the proposed funding for the next 3 years. So you see that for operations is a 10% year-over-year increase. The fleet trucks, what we're doing is proposing slightly less than 10%, but it's a 5%, $5,000 year-over-year increase. So the fleet trucks is essentially replacing 1 truck a year. By law, we've kept at 10%. Parks and Rec is slightly higher for 2024 due to some immediate funding constraints, followed by 10% year-over-year. And the fire and emergency vehicles, so this is also higher in 2024, in which we've taken some operational surpluses or savings identified in the budget, and we've proposed putting that directly back in the capital to alleviate some immediate financial concerns coming up.
Kyle, if I could just interrupt for a sec.
Yep.
I've omitted to set some ground rules for members of council this afternoon, so if there's any questions along the way, get my attention, and then instead of waiting until the end so that we kind of keep current so we don't have to go back and forth looking at different slides. Okay, thank you.
So on that fire and emergency services, there is a portion of operational savings allocated towards that. After that, in 25 and 26, we're proposing, again, following that 10% year over year. So you can see this takes our annual funding to $500,000 this current year, up to $630,000 proposed for next year. But again, you see about $45,000 of that is proposed through additional tax dollars, and the majority, $88,000, through operational savings, which we've identified and allocated to other areas of need. Okay, so I've kind of, as I mentioned before, we're trying to predict and schedule what this equipment is going to cost over year. And what we have here is our operations equipment that's scheduled for replacement from 2024 up to 2033. And this, we've actually done this over 20 years, but I've just shown 10 years here for commentary. So some assumptions here that we have done is inflationary at 5% year over year for the cost of this equipment. Again, this is a difficult number to figure. We have seen inflation be higher than this for some pieces of equipment, but you would likely assume that over a 10-year period that this would somewhat even out. This also does not include any additional equipment for growing needs, you know, through at a community or at a development or added neighborhood. There may be additional pieces of equipment needed to maintain level of service. That has not been included here as well. So this just kind of shows that what the capital reserve for
Kyle, just interrupt. Councillor Avery has a question for you.
Thank you, Mayor. So just a couple of quick questions before we move on. In this current slide, I noticed that we've got a garbage truck replacement for $239,000 in 9 years from now. Is that, are we planning on doing our own garbage pickup again? Is that why we're looking at replacing a garbage truck? And then secondly, The operational savings confused me because the last few years we've talked about taking some of that leftover operational money and putting in towards capital, and we were advised that that's not a good idea to take operational and capital and combine them together. And now we're being recommended to use operational savings to put into capital money. So I'm not 100% clear. So if you can clarify that before we go farther, I'd appreciate it.
You betcha. So on the garbage truck, that's used by our operations day to day, largely for emptying the waste disposals throughout town and some of the areas at some facilities. So did I get that right? And that's used daily?
No, it's a couple times a week, and then in the summer a lot more with the parks as well.
So that piece of equipment is used a couple times a week, and then once we get into the summer, it's used quite a bit by parks. So it's not for the residential pickup, it's more for our current staff based on the facilities there. Going back to your question on operational, so this is an area that basically was a tax-funded expense in our operating budget last year. And through some savings and adjustments we've been able to do, we do have this expense that we no longer need to fill within our operating budget. So there's two options that you can kind of consider. One is you can just utilize the savings within your operational budget, right? So it reduces the amount of tax pressure or tax source you need in your operating budget. That's the first one. The second one is you can basically repurpose the funds for something else, right? And what we've done is we've proposed repurposing those funds to capital, and you'll see coming up talking about the fire is because there are, again, inflationary pressures in which the cost of this equipment is going up quite significantly higher. So those are the kind of two options. You can either save the money in the operation budget and reduce tax support, or you can reallocate it somewhere else. Again, there was funding deficits for the fire capital, so we are proposing that as the best solution to fill that gap. So as part of this, the town under the Municipal Government Act must prepare and have a 5-year budgeted plan. So as part of this budget and presentation, what we typically do is we forecast the equipment as part of our 5-year budget, again on 5 years, and then each piece of equipment that needs to be purchased in the next year. So for example, 2024, we would go in further detail with council for authorization of that purchase. So you'll see for operations, the next piece of equipment is purchased in 2025. Those are essentially placeholders until next year's budget meeting, which will come back to council with further detail about what shape the equipment is in, further details on costs that can be discussed before the budget. So that's why we don't have any further details on these items here right now. They're essentially just placeholders for the 5-year capital plan.
We have a question for you from Councillor Chapman.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor, and maybe through council to Kyle and administration. My question is more about the asset management process and how you come up with these life expectancy figures of for each of the pieces of equipment. In my mind, I think that we see that we have a good good cycle of turnover. However, with the cost of everything going up, I would just wonder if council would consider, as we go through these slides, whether we can prolong some of the life expectancies of some of the items that we might be looking at coming up during the budget deliberations. So, for example, if an item is expected to have a life expectancy of 20 years, can we make that 22 or something? I know that in the olden days we just ran a truck till it, was pretty much done. But we're cycling through equipment much more frequently than we ever did before. So I'm just wondering if we can form a balance for the next number of years to prolong some of the some of the life cycles and use our maintenance program to continue the life cycle.
Yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily say that we were cycling through our equipment faster now, but what we're doing here is proposing the life expectancy based on kind of the the historical information of how often we're using the equipment and how long it's generally expected to last. That's what we kind of base the estimation on. And there is kind of that middle ground. You don't want to propose it too little and too late, right? You still want to get your money's worth out of it. But what we do before every purchase, so for example, when we're talking in 2024 here for Parks and Recreation, the one area we're proposing is a zero-turn mower to be replaced next year. So that one's scheduled to be replaced for next year. But what we do is we look at the equipment we have on hand and we inspect it to see what type of shape it's in, how much longer it's going to last us, and how much it's actually costing us day to day for operational. I believe the loader here that's scheduled for 2025, last year it was actually scheduled for 2024. And through discussion with our operations, they were able to invest a few $1,000s into that piece of equipment so we could extend that one more year. So this is just kind of a guess. Our best estimate. And then when we come up to replace something, we do evaluate to make sure, is it really needed to be replaced, or can we get those extra years out of it? So we're not, I guess, disposing of equipment prematurely based on that.
Thank you, Kyle, and that satisfies my question. And of course, we don't want to be approaching council with an emergency capital item there that needs to be purchased on demand right away. Thank you.
So moving on to Parks and Recreation. So this is one of the areas that did see a high inflationary pressure. So this wide area mower was actually scheduled to be replaced this year. But it's one item that, looking at it from our Parks Department, we can actually push it off one more year to 2025. So this was an item that retail purchase 18 months ago was about $130,000. We were able to get lower the deal on it for $95,000. But that piece of equipment is actually scheduled to be between $220,000 and $200,000. So that's an item that is increased by almost $100,000 and almost 100% in a little over 18 months. So kind of offset that, we're looking at pushing that back a year to see if there's any supply demand economic savings we can maybe utilize in the future and replace the zero-turn mower for next year. So that slide kind of summarizes that. So in addition to the zero-turn mower, there's two other new pieces of equipment we're kind of proposing as part of the schedule. One is a GPS line painter for a sports field that will be purchased next year for $35,000. That's replacing our current line painter that's at end of life, and a bag attachment for one of our parks tractors. This would increase efficiencies in collection and the level of service that our Parks Department is able to provide in 2026 at a cost of $63,000.
Question from Councillor Beekman.
Thank you, Mayor. Through to Kyle. Can we define life expectancy when it comes to a GPS line painter? Okay, more asking about the life expectancy, like how does it still operate, or is it dead?
It's operational, but we've started to cost us money to maintain year over year for the last 3 years, and that cost is starting to go up.
Does somebody want to come?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit more to that.
Thank you.
So yeah, the current line painter was actually down for a period of time this year. We had a few situations where we actually had to find another painter from another town to get some lines painted. We did fix it. It's operational. We plan on holding on to it as backup. But the new technology in line painting for sports fields, this new GPS line painter will save an extreme amount of money in paint, is what we're told, and manpower hours to be able to do this. And so rather than replace the existing line painter for roughly the same amount of money, we're looking at doing the GPS and holding on to that piece of equipment as backup. It'll obviously last longer when it's being used only as backup. And part of that is because with new technologies, we're certainly told, they did come and do a demonstration. There are a number of people that have this piece of equipment. And so we're not the guinea pig in any means. However, to determine its lifespan, we're still pretty new in that technology. It will save, we're estimating between $6,000 and $10,000 in paint. It uses a fraction of the amount of paint that you do on the other.
Okay, thank you for that. The idea of the GPS kind of self-sustained unit is great, but I know in like farm equipment, for instance, GPS farm equipment still needs somebody to man it. So we're not necessarily saving manpower, would we?
Well, we are, because the existing, like there's like the staff themselves, certainly they're going to have to make sure that it's operational, make sure that the programs, but it comes to us already with the predetermined programs. For the most part, the sports fields that we're creating, we, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chad, but my understanding from what I read up on the piece of equipment is once we've programmed our field size in and our lines and done it once, it's there. It's a program, and it does it on its own. And so the manpower that's being saved is certainly the manpower sitting on the other piece of equipment doing the lines themselves. They'll be in the area doing weed trimming, doing other things, but this basically works itself. Yeah, so I realize now that GPS line painter could have meant on the same piece of equipment GPS. What it actually does is it's a robot. It works itself. There's no operator on it or anything. It's basically a little robot that does the work. So,
Councillor Chapman has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. And just to follow up to Councillor Beekman's question on the same item, I believe that you would want to have this in place for the Southern Alberta Summer Games.
that's a good point. We'll likely be painting a few more lines in 2024 than we did in 2023, or we will in 2025. And certainly this would be helpful for sure.
And the onus is on the town of Coaldale to have the fields prepared for the games.
Absolutely. You're correct. Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on. So the next item, so that GPS line painter, we are proposing for 2024 here. The next item would be a zero-turn mower. So currently there is one zero-turn mower that's shared between the Parks Department and Recreation. So this does involve a lot of tractoring the unit between the quads and the various parks to cut the fields. So the current piece of equipment is at its near life expectancy. It does have a number of hours on it, again, because it is being shared between two departments. So what is being proposed is to purchase this equipment 1 year earlier, and again, delay the zero turn for 1 year. And this piece of equipment, the new one, can be used exclusively by our Parks Department, which can, again, create additional efficiencies and level of service within the parks. And we can still use the old piece of equipment, which is kind of on its last legs, but over at the quads. And that reduces the need for time and travel for trailing the piece of equipment to the different sites within the town of Coaldale. So the estimated cost at that one is $55,000.
Councillor Pickering has a question.
Thank you, Mayor Van Rijn, through to Kyle. So has this machine been tendered out, and is this the exact machine you're looking at purchasing?
So this hasn't been tendered out. This is just, this machine has been quoted at that value, near that $55,000. The price can range based on the options that you kind of add to it. So again, I assume you can get the lower, like the base model versus the high model. I'll have to ask for some help on the difference between those. But again, ultimately subject to council's approval, this equipment would be formally tendered or quoted out subject to budget deliberations.
So we're not exactly sure if this is 55 is going to cover this, because what you're talking about, the other mower went from 95 to 200. I'm just curious if this mower, when you come back is 65,000.
Yeah, so I've just kind of been informed that this 55,000 for this piece of equipment has been quoted. So we have done some research on it, talked to vendors, and we're very confident that this would fit within that budget. So subject to the price jumping significantly in the next month, we don't predict any challenges on that front.
Thank you.
The third item talked for the Parks Department here. This is a vac attachment for one of the Parks tractors. This is kind of a new piece of equipment that, as you can kind of see here, would increase efficiencies, collection for debris, as well. It does have a lot of additional services that it can provide for a Parks Department that can increase level of services and efficiencies, and kind of provide a better green space area within our park. So this is a level of service enhancement here as a new piece of equipment being proposed. But again, with kind of the budget constraints we've seen, again with that lawnmower, this one isn't proposed until 2026. So this one, subject to any questions by council, will kind of be one of those placeholders that would ultimately be revisited again as part of 2025 budget deliberations. Moving on from Parks and Rec, something a little more simple here just is the bylaw capital equipment. So there's only 3 units that we do have here. The Fuller Radar van, and then we do have 2 CBO trucks. So Fuller Radar van is scheduled for replacement in 2025, and each of the trucks in 27 and 28. Again, currently as placeholders for future budget discussions. Next is the municipal vehicle fleet. So this is a, sorry.
Go ahead, Councillor Avery.
Thank you, Mayor. So again, I'm going to ask the question. So what determines a van that's parked mostly idling? The miles on it have got to be very, very low. So is there some type of an estimate? Is it going in for repairs lots? And the same with their vehicles. Is there a mileage, or are we just going by years to replace our trucks? And are their trucks then being put into parks and recreation, or are they being sold after that?
Yeah, so on the Fuller Radar van, that's a good question, and kind of one I've had myself too. How often do you need to replace a van that just kind of sits there? One of the things though is the van is constantly idling, especially in the winter. In the summer, right, you do have the AC and the heat on, which I've been told does add quite a bit of wear and tear actually to the unit from our mechanic, and that's kind of the reason why it's scheduled for replacement in 10 years. The CPO for the vehicles, the trucks, those are one of the items that's been scheduled for kind of a 10-year life expectancy based on historical practices. When we do get to that 10 years, and if it's an evaluation of the equipment that it's still in, fine, usable shape, then maybe that's okay. We make the decision that we don't need to purchase it after 10 years. It can be extended for 15 or extended number of years if it's still in good shape as well. So this isn't anything set in stone. We do want to make sure we get proper life expectancy out of the vehicle. So if we can still use them after this estimation, we definitely will. But if this is also an item that council wants further clarification or investigation on, can we extend this schedule as part of our budgeting process? Something we can definitely look into and come back as well. The municipal fleet program, this is an item that we've kind of had in place for the past 3-4 years, I believe, in which we've started to replace one of our municipal trucks every year. So as we replace one truck, the trucks kind of get cycled down throughout the organization, in which generally the one at the end is probably about 25 years old, has been used by a number of departments, and it's kind of on its last legs, and we do dispose of the older piece of equipment. So the intention of this is by replacing one a year, we're maintaining our municipal fleet, so we don't fall into that large deficit of needing to replace 5 or 10 trucks in a year. We're keeping up on the yearly life cycle for this piece of equipment. Finally, part of the fleet, kind of the one with the biggest sticker shock here, is the fire and emergency services. So if you recall from last year's budget discussion, we did propose replacing the town's rescue truck, so R104, in 2024, and that estimate of $400,000 was a couple years old. That has now come back at $850,000. So again, that's over 100% increase from what we had budgeted a couple years ago. The town also does have a Freightliner truck, so the M2, that is scheduled for replacement in 27 at an estimated value today of $1.2 million. So in talking to our fire department, what we're kind of proposing here is to replace those two units, so the rescue truck and the Freightliner, with a new rescue engine in 2017. So we're taking two pieces of equipment and replacing it with one larger, more efficient equipment at a price point of $1.5 million. So an RFP would be required for this in 2024, as the equipment is approximately 3 years out. So that's kind of the supply issue. But from my understanding is once the equipment is ordered and tendered, they do hold that price for 3 years. So it's not like that $1.5 million that we're estimating today is subject to further inflationary pressure 3 years from out when we actually get the equipment.
We have a question from Councillor Avery.
Thank you again, Mayor. A couple questions on this one. First of all, why would it be a 100% increase? Are we still comparing apples to apples? Are we giving our local manufacturer of ITB an opportunity to continue to bid, or are we looking at a cabin chassis that they're not able to provide, so now it takes our local market completely out of the bidding process? Because if that's the case, I am completely not in favor of looking at changing anything in this fire fleet, because ITB has been a huge supporter of our fire department since 1985, 84, since I was on the department. And if we're starting to eliminate them out of the bid process, this is not good business for our town.
Yeah, so this is from a mix of pretty much all the vendors that are out there through my research of getting a hold of everybody and looking at kind of all kinds of trucks, from rescues to engines right down to wildlands and stuff like that, of where the pricing is. So this definitely isn't at the top end of what's out there right now, but it's kind of what the average is for that stuff. So it includes I checked with 6 different vendors of fire apparatus for this pricing, so it definitely wouldn't exclude someone like ITB from putting in for it.
So on the rescue, is it a want or is it a need?
With the rescue, to me, that's more of a want. That's where I see it as if we combine both into one. That's where we could operate a little more efficiently and save some money in that aspect versus trying to put 2 different trucks in. Being able to extend the life expectancy of the rescue is an easier thing than extending the life expectancy of the engine. So that's kind of where I see it as combining that into one functional apparatus to be able to meet our needs. So
the M2, the Freightliner truck, 2 questions. How many miles are on it and how many pump hours are on it? Can't its life expectancy, because it is a backup truck, because we got the elevated master stream. So according to any FUS report, as long as your frontline engine is within 15 years old, we're going to meet the requirements of the Fire's Underwriters Survey. NFPA is only a recommendation. That's not anything that's mandated within the country of Canada. So M2, we're going from a truck, a conventional truck, to looking to me like we're pricing a custom cabbed type engine. So I don't, again, this looks like a want, not a need, because we're not comparing an apple to an apple. This M2 truck I don't think is more than $550,000, $600,000 if we replace that truck.
Currently, right now, you're looking closer to that $1 million to 1.2
for that truck.
For that truck, again. So that's where, again, in combining it, and maybe getting a little bit of a bigger, more custom truck is where I've seen the savings between the rescue and the engine instead of two separate.
Okay. So back to my other statement of fire underwriters, can we not prolong the life of that truck? It doesn't have to be replaced at 15 or 20 years. It can go to 25 years. As long as it passes the annual pump test, it is a truck that meets all the requirements to be an engine to respond.
As a second line, yeah.
Thank you.
And Councillor Chapman has a question, but before I give him the opportunity, can you just clarify for everyone around the council table and our viewers at home to visualize how you're going to combine the rescue with the pump?
Just more so designing it with proper cabinet space built into it. Right now, if you were to look at our engines, we wouldn't have adequate cabinet space to combine into one truck as we sit right now. It's more or less just making sure it's designed appropriately to do so.
Thank you. Councillor Chapman, your question?
I guess, oh, here we go. Thank you, Mayor, through to our fire chief. I guess maybe because I don't sit on the fire department, I don't know what the two units look like or what their capacity is for service. So what I'm envisioning you saying here is that you're trying to combine two units into one unit that is much more robust and more serviceable. I guess the reason for that question is because if we're just going to be looking at M2, which is the Freightliner fire truck, I guess my thinking is that either you can keep the piece of equipment that it's running on, or you change the cabin chassis and just buy a new cabin chassis and use the other equipment that's on the truck already, or do you have to still build a whole new system?
Are you talking like the actual equipment or the pump itself?
Sorry,
more
I guess
like
the
pump.
pump is another item, but certainly the rest of the equipment.
Yeah, a lot of our equipment carries over. As Councillor Avery mentioned, though, the pump itself, once it does reach a certain age, it doesn't have that rating to it. So eventually, at some point, it would have to change over.
All right, so then the cabin chassis part is something you wouldn't consider as a separate purchase, and then just remount all your other stuff to that cabin chassis.
Eventually, it would have to get changed over, yeah.
Okay.
Councillor Pickering has a question.
Thank you, Mayor Van Rijn. I got one question. So how often do these two trucks go out at the same time? Like what you're doing here is you're combining one into two. We are growing as a town and we're serving more of the county. And I'm kind of looking at it kind of like as Mr. Councillor Avery has there. We do this as we expand. Now you're taking one unit out. If we get called out double.
It's kind of a two-sided piece as well. As we get busier, if we're shorter on manpower, oftentimes it sees us coming back to the station to have to change out because our rescue doesn't have a pump on it. So oftentimes we see ourselves having to come back, change out vehicles to respond to certain types of calls as well. So there's kind of the double side of it. We would still have enough vehicles in our fleet to be able to manage, though, even as a growing community.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so this is an item I just kind of started to, so we can circle back on this at the end of the presentation and see if this is something too that council wants further information as part of the next budget meeting as well. So just staying on the assumption here that we've described, so this is what the fire and emergency services fleet capital reserve would look like for the next 5 years up till 2028. So you do see the proposed expense in 27 here, the large 1.5 million for the rescue engine as proposed. Again, this does assume the annual funding allocation of 10% increase year over year to keep up with inflationary pressures and increasing costs of equipment as we proceed here. And this is just kind of a summary of, a summary of the 5-year capital plan that we've discussed for all the departments for fleet. So from operations through parks, rec, bylaw, the municipal fleet and fire, you'll see the total investment would be $3.6 million over 5 years, obviously with the lion's share of that being the rescue engine from the fire department discussed here. So it's kind of a summary of what we've discussed so far.
We have a question from Councillor Avery, and then also just to members of council, do not turn your mics on until I get your attention because we have so many speakers going.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a couple questions on the last two items. 25% of a 3/4 ton truck. So we're estimating in 2027, 3/4 ton truck is going to cost $200,000.
Yeah, so sorry, that is an error. That word should be 50%.
Okay. And then 403, the town portion of the, in year 2025, that is 25% of that truck.
That is correct, yeah. So the estimated cost on that one currently is $200,000.
Okay. And can I get a little bit of an explanation on that?
On the cost of that?
Yeah, why 200,000?
Sure. Okay.
Okay. That E403 is a wildland. So right now, pricing for the wildlands are currently somewhere around the 125 to 150,000, as far as I know where they sit. If you were to purchase today.
Okay, so you're not, I was around when that truck was put in service, and then years later the skid package was put into the back. So you're not looking at repurposing that and putting it back into the new truck, because it's definitely not the same age category as what the pickup is.
I think our skid pack would be starting to near the end of its life by the time we get to there.
Councillor Reese had a question.
Thank you, Mayor Van Rijn, through to Kyle or our chief. Just wondering where the 75% is going to come from for these vehicles here. For clarification, please.
Yeah, so the other portion that we're referring, so the 75 and the 25, that relates to our fire service agreement with Lethbridge County. So they're responsible for a portion of capital for the services we do provide. And so the figures you do see here are just the town portion.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, moving on from part one to the fleet capital there, we're going to move to a part that's a little, we have a few less slides on here. This is the buildings and facilities capital budget. So when we're talking about, again, so the buildings and facilities, the funds that we generally put aside for the areas that you see in this budget are designed for the maintenance and upkeep once the building is built. So, for example, in the past, it's been replacement of boilers or HVACs or a roof or various architectural elements of the building. These reserves aren't designed to genuinely replace these facilities in the long term, and that just comes back to the sheer financial cost that would be required to maintain enough funds to replace each of these buildings as their life expectancy comes to an end. So what we're trying to do here is maintain and upkeep the buildings in a way that extends the life expectancy as best we can. And again, it all goes back to the capital infrastructure deficit that the town and every other community in Canada is currently facing. So part of this is we've just kind of picked a proposed number here. Again, subject to deliberations here from council, but similar to fleet, we've kind of proposed a 15% year-over-year tax increase. Sorry, not a tax increase, 15% year-over-year funding increase to each of these facility reserves. And you'll see on the next slide how that kind of projects out here. But again, this has helped to maintain and mitigate future inflationary pressures and reduce our reliance on external capital grants and debt funding that the town does rely on for other capital projects. Again, alternatives to funding increases, we can reduce the amount of proposed increase, or we can increase the reliance on other funding sources such as capital grants or debenture funding to finance these expenses as they do occur. So this is kind of a summary of what we've proposed here. So you do see from left to right. So we do have the allocation, the reserve balance for 2022. So total funds $976,000. With the allocation expenses for this year, that balance is expected to reduce to $930,000. And then the only two projects that we currently have on the books for 25 would be the exterior painting and sealing of the museum, followed by the library roof replacement in 2026. So there may be additional projects added to this in subsequent years as things break, with lack of a better word. But that would kind of leave an increased balance to fund the repairs to these facilities as they occur, with the balance ending up near 1.7 million in 2026. So again, the ultimate funding increase required, this will tie back to the operational budget at our next budget meeting, as it ties to a tax increase. But this does provide council some type of context and image of what we're trying to save here, essentially, for the future of these facilities.
Thanks, Kyle. I just have a question from Councillor Avery.
Thanks again, Mayor. Just one question and something that's a little bit concerning for me is the amount that we're putting away for the town shop. That's one of our older facilities that's been around for probably 50 plus years. And I think we should be looking at prioritizing replacing that, because if we don't have a good place for our staff to work out of and to repair, I think we're going to be in trouble. So, even in 2 years, we're only going to have 218,000 in a reserve for that. So I would like some more attention being put to that area at this time.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So kind of twofold, just kind of in an answer to that. So we can definitely kind of sit down as an administrative team and look at this allocation here to kind of perhaps prioritize this and present some proposals to council on that. Ultimately, the cost to replace the building for the shop, like any of these other facilities, are going to be, in excess of millions. So generally, there's two options to replace a facility like this based on the reserves we do have. One is you can use grants like your Canada Community Building Fund or your LGFF to replace these facilities. It's kind of an option that we did do with Civic Squares. We did use some grant funding to replace that. Second option is if you do kind of increase the amounts you're putting into reserves every year. So say at the end of the day, you're putting $50,000 a year into that reserve, and you do need to replace that facility. If you take out debenture debt, you can use that reserve funding to essentially fund the debt payment for that building. Because if you build a brand new building, you don't necessarily need to put as much into the reserves right away to fix it and keep it up. So that's the way to kind of mitigate some of those pressures there as well. So I won't touch too much on the previous requests on the books here. Again, those are just placeholders for the museum and the library for 2025 and 2026. But I will kind of touch on some of the new items here. So at the last council meeting, October 23rd, Council did receive a request from the senior center to replace the LED lighting. So currently, sorry, to replace it with new LED lighting at a cost of estimated $25,000. So currently, administration is exploring grants available for this item. Dependent on the outcome, it is possible that the grant could fund the full cost of this, or we could be unsuccessful and it could fund none of it. So kind of a question to leave for council is dependent on the grant funding. What level of funding would council want to commit to this expense, if any? This is an item that we can leave as a placeholder for now and have it contingent on grant funding, and then ultimately revisit with council once the outcome of that grant is discussed, or we could have a more firm commitment now should council choose that option.
Thank you. Councillor Chapman has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. And Kyle, you answered most of my question about looking at the grant process. And what I would like to see, I know that the LED lighting throughout your presentation tonight is obviously more global than just the one location. So when we're speaking about LED lighting for a number of our town-owned facilities, I would certainly encourage Russ and other teams to really review this item and whether we can apply for a grant that would supply lighting to LED lighting, say to the arena, the senior center being one, the library, and a number of other town-owned facilities would be really a better way, in my opinion, than just trying to isolate this, because I think at this point in time, the seniors may be willing to take on an appointment to defer this item to another budget year, or we find other solutions that are much more economical for this. And I've been hearing debate on this specific item where this item and whoever puts it in could reduce the cost considerably. So it's something that we need to continue to review, but don't lose it out of your radar screen, but certainly you focus on it as part of a larger, robust system.
Point definitely noted. Thank you, Councillor. So continuing on the new requests, so we'll move on to the library. So again, we touched base before, the roof is expected life cycle replacement in 2026 for $50,000. Again, this is another placeholder that when we actually do come up to this year, it's not something that's automatically going to be replaced. It will be reviewed and evaluated by our facilities department just to make sure that we're not replacing anything earlier than we need to. And then two new items requested from the library. The first item is a funding for a universal restroom. So estimated cost for that would be $44,000, of which $24,000 is requested from the town of Coaldale. And the other $20,000 would be coming from the library board and their operating reserves that they have and are held by the town of Coaldale. Following that, again, is the same request as the senior center for LED lighting in the facility, with a bigger facility that's estimated at $45,000.
Councillor Chapman.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor, and maybe through to our chief librarian, our head librarian, Dothlan. This construction of a universal restroom, is that a need or a want? My question there. And if I remember, there were some deficiencies in earlier bathrooms that I'd noted in years past. Would you be able to answer that question?
The board is now consider it a need. We're one of the main public facility in this area for families. And currently, there is no facility if fathers come in with their kids for them to go into a restroom. So sometimes they literally just do it in the library, or they have to go out to their cars. And we also thought when we did our plan of service that looking at Coaldale and the library that it would be nice to have a restroom where everybody can, I don't know, access to it. And in keeping with I think the disability accessibility group, we were trying to, I guess, 3 stones, try to use 1 stone to fit 3 problems. So the accessibility studies that the accessibility group came up with, that we thought that will also address that issue as well. So definitely a need.
Thank you, Dotlin, and that gives the best clarity to a question I have. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So when we're looking at funding here, this is an item that when we're just looking at simply the reserves, should all 3 of those be funded? You can see the library town reserve does have a deficit at the end of 2026, and I did have some proposed options here, but kind of the sense I'm getting from Councillor Chapman's previous comment is that we do prioritize the lighting, possibly through dependent on these grants through the town as a whole, and kind of see how that may be a possible solution to this.
Just a question for Dotlin. For the Friends of the Library, the fundraising that they do, where do their funds go?
For the most part, so far, it has been going towards mostly programming. So we currently run a chess club that sometimes comes up to $1,000. So they help to offset that cost. So patron pay $50 instead of the $100. So primarily now it's programming. I know they are looking at doing a casino, but even that fund is going to go towards programming instead of capital project.
Thank you.
Okay, so that kind of concludes part 2 here for the buildings and facilities capital. So we'll move on to part 3. So that's kind of construction projects. So majority of these projects, council and the public have been provided further previous detail on the exact specification of the project as part of last budget meeting, or updates throughout this past council term. So as you see through, once we go through these slides, there's not as much specific detail on the project as itself, more so financial updates and budgeting updates. So just kind of a precursor there. So first is our recreation facility, which is nearing completion, expected to be open here early 2024. So the approved budget for this was $18.8 million, of which we're expected to be essentially bang on budget. So not expecting any overages at this time, but again, we're not expecting any savings at this time. So part of that budget was the assumption of net fundraising revenue of $1.875 million. Currently, Russ and his team have done a really good job with this. We've got to $1.824 million. That does leave the budget short by approximately $51,000. Looking at how to fund this, the town does have some, I'm going to jump a slide here. Looking at how to fund that deficit for the recreation center, with the MSI program ending this year, all those funds do have to be spent by the end of the year, and we do anticipate approximately $25,000 in MSI funding that won't be spent. So rather than return that to the province, we can easily just shift that funding towards this project. So that does leave a deficit balance of $26,000, which we could easily cover through year-end operational surplus, or there may be additional fundraising or somewhat of a surplus once the construction of the project is finally completed in 2024. Going on to the next part of the recreation center is the funding for furniture and equipment. So part of the business plan for this initially was to fund the majority of this through fundraising efforts. But as the costs for the building did increase and we had to kind of transition scope there a bit, the fundraising was directed largely to capital, and if we did have extra, it was going to be directed for this furniture and equipment. But again, as you can kind of see here, we don't have the extra funding from fundraising for that. So in costing this out, the estimated F&E budget for the new facility is $330,000. But we have $80,000 in donations committed or expected to be received, which does leave a funding gap of $250,000. So this is kind of a Coles Notes breakdown of the F&E funding here. So you can see this ranges from field curtains to bleachers, score clocks, tables and chairs, office equipment, floor scrubber, LED board, and various items here. So as part of a proposed funding, the LGFF funding, which still, the balance hasn't been confirmed yet by the provincial government, but when we did have budget last year, we did estimate this a little conservatively at $1.2 million based on the information we had at the time. What the feedback we've kind of been getting now is that this funding won't be reduced from MSI, the past 3-year historical average, which is for the town is about 1.3 million. And we've also heard that this funding may increase by approximately 14% on top of that as well, which would bring that total funding from our previously estimated of 1.2 million to about 1.45 to 1.47 million. With that additional funding expected from LGFF, we're proposing to allocate that to the capital F&E portion of the Recreation Center to mitigate that funding gap. Okay, that concludes the Recreation Center part of it. Question?
Councillor Chapman, or I'm sorry, Councillor Avery has a question.
Thanks, Mayor. So with these extra F&E costs, we didn't know that these were going to be costs 3 years ago when we were building the facility, and they weren't worked into our pricing when we were tendering out something like that, or were they something that was cut out of the tender? I was just a little bit shocked to see that after an $18 million project that we still have a $300,000 table and chair budget.
Yeah, so I might ask Russ to kind of help supplement this answer, but I don't believe the F&E was included as part of the tender price. When the building was tendered and we're looking at the budget and the overages, we had the original budget fully funded, and then the intention was to supply the F&E through fundraising efforts that would ultimately pay for that. But as the cost of the project and the inflationary challenges increased, we did have to allocate some of that proposed funding from F&E to the capital for this. And when you're dealing with a fundraising program, there's some uncertainty as to how successful it could be, how it's going to go. So we had budgeted that 1.875 towards the capital, and then anything over and above we had designed to go towards that F&E. We did meet our fundraising goal. We didn't exceed it, so that kind of puts us to where we are now. Russ, I'll let you.
You bet. Yeah, no, everything Kyle said is accurate, but I guess the way I'd describe it is the very first version of the budget had $1 million fundraising campaign, and the F&E budget at that time was $1 million, but it also included the dasher boards, the basketball hoops, a bunch of the equipment, the synthetic turf, all that. When there was inflation, the fundraising then was put into the capital facility project, and some of those synergies and things we knew would help out with costs with the sports supplier that's doing the flooring and everything like that is also doing dasher boards and things like that. That was also put back into that budget, and with the help of some partners and with the construction budget, we were able to absorb $800,000 into that construction. We increased the fundraising goal to $2 million to both help with the inflations of mainly the steel at that time that inflated in 2019, I believe it was. But with those inflations, that fundraising went into that budget. And then what we tried to do as part of the fundraising as well is we tried to earmark a bunch of these pieces of equipment that you're seeing here and see if we couldn't get people to start to purchase. So we were hoping that we could actually fundraise more than the $2 million and be able to take care of some of these items in that. This comes to us now after a few years of fundraising. I don't think fundraising is completely done, but this is a snapshot in time as right now as to how the budget's doing. And much of this equipment that we forwarded to you in this is part of the programs of the facility, as you could imagine, with the curtains and things like that. Will certainly affect, if we don't have it, will affect rentals and use of the facility by different user groups and things. So we'd like to know that we can put that in there, but by no means have we stopped searching for donors that quite possibly could, purchase the curtain and put their logo on it, or purchase some of this equipment that's coming in, tip and roll bleachers, things like that.
So as a follow-up then, if this stuff hasn't been ordered and if we've got a 30-month delay time on ordering a truck, what's the delay time on getting curtains? Our slide for our pool we approved last year at this time, it's still not in. So are we still behind on purchasing this stuff, or has it been ordered? My concern now is that if it's not here, it's not going to be by the time we open in March.
So that's a very good question. We've been in close contact with the suppliers of this equipment and have been watching the timelines for it. As I previously mentioned, oftentimes, although we will go out and make sure we get the best price possible, but oftentimes the same people that are in that facility that are coming in and should be arriving on site in the next few months and being there till the end of the project are also the people that have the ability to bring the curtain and tip and roll bleachers and other things. And at this point in time, we're only looking at a few months to 3 to 5 months lead time. So our timing is okay right now, is good.
Councillor Reese has a question.
Thank you, Mayor Van Rijn, through to Russ. So I, just like Jason Avery, was kind of shocked when I read this report and I saw that the bleachers, the clocks, soccer, the score clock for basketball, tables and chairs was not incorporated into into the budget beforehand. And I'm just curious to know, is this going to be it for the rec center now, or can we expect more things to come our way that will need funding?
Thank you, Councillor Reese. It's a fair question to ask. Certainly we weren't looking at surprising. We were hoping to bring a number to you that was the final number as you just asked. And yes, it is the final number. We, if anything, will see that shrink.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on further, we're going to go to the next project here. So that's the Northeast Industrial Park paving. So this project is scheduled for 2024, cost of $135,000, and currently that's still scheduled for 2024 with no update or no change required for the budget. So this is just kind of a FYI, still proceeding on this for next year. The outdoor civic square space. So this is an update on that. So at the August 2nd council meeting, council did approve the budget for just under $4.5 million. So I've kind of broken down the budget here in twofold between confirmed and unconfirmed funding, sorry. So we do have the confirmed funding of $3.6 million, with the unconfirmed related to fundraising, and the portion the deficit that was going to be funded through debenture debt that may be eliminated through construction costs or additional funding that may come up. Currently, administration has applied for a $1 million CFEP grant for this program, and we should know the result of that here in the next few weeks by the end of the month. So if we are successful in that, twofold, it does allow us to reduce that debenture debt. and council can either adjust the scope of the project or repurpose some of the funds from this project to another capital project should they want to. Next project on the docket here is the intersection upgrades. So at Land O'Lakes Drive and 21st Avenue. So this is the roundabout, as council can see on the screen here, between the McDonald's, Tim Hortons, Fast Gas, and Land O'Lakes Dental. So this project is scheduled for 2025 at an estimated cost of $900,000. You can see some of the technical details on the screen here. And this project, again, we're not proposing any changes to the scope or cost of this. So this is still status quo for 2025.
Councillor Beekman has a question.
Thank you. There's 3 spots of note here that are land that has to be acquired. Has there already been talks in place with those 3 landowners about acquiring that land?
Thank you. Councillor Beekman, Dustin Yankee, Manager of Infrastructure. We have not spoke with them about acquiring yet. So this is a preliminary design drawing. Once we get closer to construction into detailed design, we can nail down what that exact area is and if we need it. These are just a preliminary assumption based off of the generic layout. So we'll still fine tune the design more, and then at that point, once we have assurance with what we need, we'll approach the landowners.
Councillor Reese has a question.
Thank you, Mayor Van Rijn. Through to Kyle, I have a question about, can you tell us who is going to be doing the work? Will it be town employees or are you hiring it out?
Thank you for the question. So the project will be designed by, it's already partially been designed by ISL Engineering, and then we would post it for tender. So it's not a project that we would do in-house. There's actually quite a bit of surfacing and concrete work that is required that would be out of scope of something that we would have capability in-house.
Thank you.
Councillor Pickering has a question.
Thank you, Mayor Van Rijn. Just to clarify, this is a two-lane roundabout, or is it starting as one and then changing to 2?
Thanks for the question, Councillor Pickering. This is the 2-lane roundabout option. So if council may recall, last year, this time we discussed the 2 options, and presented was the single-lane roundabout, which has less capacity, which would require upgrades in approximately 10 years just due to traffic counts with further development. The alternative option was this dual-lane roundabout, which is basically built for the future, and then you don't have to add the additional lane. So long-term, the cheaper option is to do the dual-lane roundabout, which we're proposing for 2025.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, moving on to the next project here. So we do have the 20th Street and the 30th Ave intersectional improvements here, as you can kind of see on the image. So this is partially triggered by further development in the area. So again, just kind of another conceptual design of 30th Ave and Highway 45 here, where the upgrades would take place. The cost for that is estimated at $400,000, scheduled for 2025. Again, no change for this one for council's discussion at this moment. Still for 2025, project to commence with a budget of $400,000.
Councillor Chapman has a question, then Councillor Avery.
Thank you, Mayor, and maybe through to Kyle or to Dustin, if I may. You made a note here about 17th Street requires upgrades as well, but it's expected that these upgrades will take place and be handled by the developer as part of the South Cole development. Is that something you're keeping an eye on? And we'll be hearing further progress on that?
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Chapman. I know our development team has had interest in development in the area. So once that gets further along, there'll be more details that come to council on in terms of timing and scope in terms of 17th Street. But more or less that point itself was made to highlight that those upgrades would likely be happening in concurrence with each other.
Thank you. Just wondering if these costs, are they going to be paid from offsite levies from those developments?
Yeah, the majority of the costs will be funded through offsite levies. And so of the $400,000, we're using $357,000 from offsite levies for road. So only approximately $43,000 from municipal taxes. Moving on to the next project here. So the next one is the pathway along Rehoboth. So this was approved for 2025 at a cost of, at a cost of $200,000. I do see an error in my slide here that you'll see 400, but that is still at $200,000. So the only changes that we're kind of showing here, the council, is just a slight allocation difference between our CCBF grant and our pathway reserve, $10,000 in funding there. That's just kind of to match up some of the grants for the other projects as well. But nothing proposed change on this project currently.
Councillor Chapman has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Just what, if you could answer the acronym CCBF?
That's the Canada Community Building Fund, so that's the old gas tax grant.
Thank you.
The next item is the Highway 3.
We're just going to let Councillor Avery ask a follow-up question, please.
Sorry, Kyle, just for clarity on my previous question, because I was reading the slide at the same time. That 356 we already have in offsite levies?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
So the Highway 3 and Land O'Lakes Drive, pedestrian crossing. So this is one that is scheduled for next year. So again, a kind of a site map of what is being proposed here as far as this. This is the one where we've had some unfortunate luck in dealing with CP Rail. So our budget estimates last year when we discussed this with council was $1,085,000. But we have been downloaded a significant cost increase from CP Rail that has increased this to $1.45 million. So administration still currently is discussing with CP Rail about a possible reduction to the level of scope of the work that they're requesting. The level and scope has increased what they're asking now has increased from what we estimated previously, and we're still working to kind of see if we can get that down and somewhat reduce the cost as well. So when we're just purely talking on numbers here, so how, assuming worst case scenario, this project still does go with CPs at a cost of $1.45 million, how can we essentially fund this? And what we did was, again, kind of look at our grant funding, so we're not using any additional tax dollars. And the majority of it would kind of be a funding swap here between our fleet reserve and our LGFF, so Local Government Fiscal Framework Grant. Essentially what we would be doing is taking funds from our fleet reserve, spending those in 2024, and then using that grant funding, which is available in 2025, and allocating that towards fleet purchases in 2025. So this is a method just to kind of get the grant funding allocated in a manner that we can use it 1 year earlier. And $90,000 increase would come from the pathway reserve that would fully utilize the balance remaining in this reserve account. Just an item of note too, that should the outdoor civic space be successful in that additional $1 million CFEP grant, this is also an opportunity that we could redirect some of the savings from that project back to this pedestrian crossing to alleviate some of that pressure as well. So there is somewhat kind of a contingency here based on our discussion with CP Rail, as well as the outcome of that CFIP grant. So this 1.45 is the highest cost estimated right now. But again, we should know a little more in the next month once we hear back from that grant and further discussions with CP Rail.
Kyle, I just have a follow-up question for Dustin regarding his discussions with CP Rail. Was it ever brought up about funneling the pedestrians so that they're forced to go the route we want them to by means of a chain link fence, or is that not part of the scope now?
Thank you, Mayor Van Rijn. Part of the discussion in terms of fence is to, I guess I should say, part of the scope that they've defined is to channel the fencing across the tracks so that people get to the intersection and essentially will be forced to go through the corridor, which the fencing will continue the entire way. The other piece of fence that is being requested by them is from the Highway 845 intersection heading west to the first acreage. So essentially trying to deter pedestrians from walking across the train tracks and across the highway through that section of undeveloped green space that exists between Highway 845 and that first acreage. And that would be a 4-foot chain link fence is what they're requesting.
Thank you, because my only concern is kids will be kids and they'll always take the shortest route. So if they have opportunity to cross the tracks wherever and then walk along the southern boundary of those acreages to get to the pathway, CP Rail has no concerns about them crossing the tracks wherever they want. Because originally when these discussions were held, it was discussed about putting a chain link fence in from 30th to the crossing and then from the crossing to 845. So that's no longer part of the scope than my understanding is.
Yeah, I can't comment on, I guess, original discussions, but based off my discussions and the agreement that they proposed to us, there's no requirement for a fence the entire way.
Thank you. Councillor Chapman.
Thank you, Mayor. So I guess just a follow-up question, and the idea is that more of like a tunnel chain link fence would be the version that they're looking for.
That's correct. From the intersection of where the pedestrians would cross, they would be funneled into the fence on each side of them.
Kaylin has it.
Our CAO has a comment. Go ahead, Kaylin.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. In terms of the scope that's required as part of this project, CP, after conducting a detailed review, has defined what the scope must be as part of this contract. That doesn't prevent us from looking at adding additional fencing later. And my suggestion is that if we want to expand the scope of fencing, that we tie that to the Rail Safety Improvement Fund, which is a federal grant. And that way you can get additional fencing if it's required, paid for, or largely paid for through the federal government. If we try to expand the scope of fencing beyond what CP is requiring now, we likely won't hear an answer from the feds on whether we're successful in the funding, and then we'll be paying 100% of the cost of that additional fencing. So just kind of a timing issue, but also there's nothing stopping us from looking at different fencing enhancements later.
Thank you. And then Councillor Chapman has a follow-up question.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. My follow-up question is to Kyle with regards to the definition of fleet reserve and pathway reserve. Could you just help me understand both of those, where those monies would be from?
Yeah, so the fleet reserve, if you refer back to section 1 of basically this presentation, so we talked about, for example, operations in which there currently is $200,000 a year allocated to a fund that ultimately pays for our operations equipment. So what we're proposing as part of this is that when we're looking at the funding gap, we do have this project commencing in 2024, but there's not additional grant funding available in 2024. It's fully kind of committed to other projects. However, we did have some grant funding in 2025 that wasn't fully committed to other projects. So what we did as administration was look at how can we kind of shift our 25 grants into an area of need, which is this pathway for 24. So what we can do is essentially take the funding that's been earmarked for our fleet reserve, and we can allocate that towards this pathway. The opposite then is how to fund those projects within your fleet reserve. Those projects are scheduled for 2025, so then we can take the unused grants and apply those towards those projects. The pathway reserve, so a few years ago when the other pathways throughout town were being built, there was a total funding committed of $1.25 million towards that pathway project in those reserves. And the balance left in that is essentially the savings from that project that we've held on to, that we've been able to redistribute to other pathway programs like the Rehoboth pathway and this pedestrian crossing as well. So the two difference between those ones is the fleet reserve is one that we're allocating funds to it annually. So every year we're putting a little more into that reserve to fund these future expenses. The fleet reserve was a kind of a one-time thing that we allocated funds, capital funds for that, in which the question will come up later for discussion, but we're not allocating anything to your pathway reserve right now. So when I say those reserves are fully allocated as part of this, it means that the funds in that pathway reserve would be fully spent, but we're not contributing anything to a future pathway reserve at this moment. So this is just kind of a breakdown summary between the previous funding and the new proposed funding here. Again, there's some contingency on this based on grants and discussion with CPRL as well. The next project on the docket here is the skate park. So previous budget approved of $1 million, with the town's contribution being $400,000, and the remaining coming from local community partnerships and various contingent grants. So again, these grants, they're somewhat dependent on the outcome, which can affect the scope of the project. There is some design currently happening for this project, but again, no town funds are allocated to 2025, and there's currently no budget discussion proposed at this minute from administration. And then just to kind of summarize on that grant funding, so the biggest item of change here, if you look at the LGFF, so Local Government Fiscal Framework, as I'm sure all of council is aware, this is replacing MSI, in which the provincial government has been very slow in letting us know our allocation. Last year we had estimated $1.2 million, but again, on recent chatter kind of from the province, we're estimating this between 1.45 and $1.5 million. So we're projecting the added grant funding here to help offset some of these additional costs. And we're fairly confident in that number right now, but again, it's still just kind of an estimation until we get formal confirmation by the provincial government. So this could change. It could go up, could go down, but we believe we're kind of have a fairly accurate estimation at this point. Okay, so the next project here we're going to touch base on is part number 4, so our capital budget and our utility projects. So the first 2 items that we're going to talk about are the stormwater fountains. So the one in the Cottonwood Pond is scheduled for a $60,000 expense to replace 2 fountains. In the Cottonwood Storm Pond for 2025 at $70,000 for the addition of 2 new fountains. So one is still scheduled for next year. Again, no proposed changes right now from administration. And these are just kind of the budget sheets that we carried forward from last year, just providing some more commentary on these projects as well for our viewers. Yeah, so the next project here, a little bigger in scope, is our Malloy 2B project. So what I'll maybe do is kind of let Dustin speak on the scope changes here, and then I will go over the financial impact after that.
So originally when this project was conceived back in 2017 was when the cost estimate was completed. At that point, there was 2 grants that were applied for, which we were successful in receiving, that being the ACRP and the ISIP funding. Since 2017, there's been significant cost increases, also changes in scope, additional work required to, I guess, meet the same outcomes. So we're proposing between the tri-party, that being Lethbridge County and St. Mary's River Irrigation District, who have completed projects together in the past, to reduce the scope for Phase 2B, essentially split it into 2 different projects. So we go to this slide. So you can see here, it's kind of hard to read, but essentially there's a green box on the left, which is the pond that's south of Cottonwood. We're essentially removing that from the other green box, removing that from the scope for now. And the plan for this current project would be to construct the conveyance from the Cottonwood pond and tie the Cottonwood pond into the system, which would connect it into the raw water reservoirs. So based on the original Malloy 2B scope, the only real difference we're making is just removing that south pond south of Cottonwood. And there's no real functional difference in terms of removing it from the project. We simply have less capacity for the pipeline. Once the pond is completed, we'll essentially be able to handle more water as it comes into Coaldale, and it'll serve as a buffer when that pipeline becomes inundated.
Dustin, I just have a question for you on that. So with the change in scope, we won't be totally protected from overland flooding from the south. Like several of us stood there in 2014 when we saw that, I don't know which avenue that is, breached, and then all that overland flooding flooded the Cottonwood Pond. And I understand about the release portion, but to stop the overland flooding, if we get another rain event like we did in 2014 where it breached, is there any plans on how we're going to control that, or we're just going to let it happen?
Oh, it's a good question. So there's a few, I guess, facets of this project. One being that we have control over Cottonwood Pond now. So in the past, we have been, or still are today, holding all the water in Cottonwood until post-event, and then St. Mary's gives us permission to release the water. With this pipeline being constructed, essentially that Cottonwood Pond will continuously drain into the raw water reservoirs. So we're getting a significant increase in capacity from that. And then just to go back to 2014, the Cottonwood Pond has been increased in size since then, and there was a small allocation for some off-site storage flows to go in there as well. So looking back at 2014, I would say even today, there's much more capacity than there was. And then talking about the pond to the south, pushing that off doesn't necessarily put us at risk. It's just when you're talking about stormwater, you're talking about probabilities. So we're designing this for a 1 in 100 year storm. And that's essentially the benchmark that the province outlines for stormwater management. So we're simply just not reaching that 1 in 100 year storm without that pond being constructed. Hopefully that answers your question.
Councillor Pickering has a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mayor Van Rijn. Dustin, do we have a final total cost of this project, for this? Because if we're taking out the pond, I know in that deleting that, we've already established that if one of the developments go, we are going to be using some of that dirt into 2 different developments. So what I'm asking is, when will, is there a time, like I know you want to complete this, and when is this going to start?
So that leads me into my next slide here. I'll hopefully answer all your questions here. So the reduced scope cost is 5.784 million. We would apply the grant funding that we have received to date. And if you may recall, back in the summer, we submitted a letter to the province requesting top-up funding, which was endorsed by Lethbridge County as well as SMRID. We recently received some correspondence from their team, which has sounded promising. So part of that ask was for an additional 1.962 million. So adding that with the grant funding received to date already, we would be able to complete the reduced scope of the project for a value of 520,000 each, which is I believe 240,000 more than it's already been budgeted at 280. So that's the reduced scope of the project. The pond south of Cottonwood, you made a comment about having developers dig it for us. That's another large reason about why we want to phase it, is because it gives us time to have developers essentially dig it for us, which could substantially reduce the cost of it. Until those requests come in, it's hard to say what it will cost, but based off face value of how much dirt needs to be removed from there, we're looking at about $5.3 million for that phase of the project. So saying that now, assuming it's going to be quite a bit less. The other piece of that is that we have applied for DMAF funding through the federal government, which would provide up to 40% funding for that part of the project, being the South Pond.
So we do have a design size for that already?
Yes, pretty much, I guess, all the components of this project have been sized as part of the Malloy Drain Master Plan. So it's, yeah, through the preliminary design we've done recently, the ponding has been sized alongside the conveyance so that they work in conjunction with one another. And
this is going to start next year?
In terms of timing, so we have budget approval for the 280,000 through the tri-party. St. Mary's and the county are requesting up to this 520 contingent on us getting the funding, in which, so if we do get the funding, we are very likely going to have to start next year. It's going to be a condition of them giving us the money, is that they want us to get going right now and spend the money. If we don't get the money, we would be coming back to council for direction through another increase in budget, or look at deferring the project further to 2025. The only risk in deferring is that the grant funding we have received, I guess to say it with less words, we have to start spending the money that we've received. We've been sitting on it since 2020, and the grant coordinators have indicated that, yeah, there's some, I guess, pressure to start doing work. So there's just some risk if we push this project too far down the road and keep on waiting for more funding to come in, that we could lose the funding that we already have. So if we don't get the top-up funding next year, we would be coming back to council for direction on that.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Avery has a follow-up question.
Thank you. So these numbers that we're working with are estimates, as nothing has been RFP'd, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
And what are the possibilities to save money for the town to project manage it? You know, it's going to be a project that's going to be 1 or 2 years. Is it cheaper to bring in another engineer to project manage this than paying an outside agency, 10% of this project, which is $500,000, to project manage it?
That's a fair question. That I would see the challenge with where we're at in terms of particularly timing being piece number one, is that it does take an employee a fair amount of time to get up to speed, but the larger part is that we don't have a lot of the in-house resources and standard documents that make those jobs easier, whereas consulting firms have everything in place, all the systems in place. So for us to take a project of that scale in-house would be a challenge, and I wouldn't view, I guess, the cost savings versus the efficiencies and potential scope issues. I guess would just be another consideration in terms of risk. So just for the scale of the project, I do believe that the best option is to hire a consulting firm to have the additional experience and expertise that their senior level of engineers would also be able to support as a corporate level.
Okay, kind of moving on again, just to summarize some of the financials here. So as Dustin talked about, this is kind of contingent on the additional top-up funding of just under $2 million that we've, requested. So what we've done here is kind of broken out our stormwater reserve to the various projects that we've presented already, and the ones that we have on the books. So this reserve summary is under the assumption that we would receive the additional funding. So the projects scheduled here, the Southern Regional Stormwater Project, that is that large multi-community project in which the town has committed funding for phase 1 of approximately $460,000. We did provide half the payment this year, and we will have provide the later half of the payment in 2024. Just a note on that the town has committed to phase 1. We haven't committed to anything past phase 1, but there may be additional funding requests from the group heading that project for funds in the futures. So just kind of a FYI, something to consider if that's something that council wants to be part of in the future. That may come up as well. Less the Cottonwood storm ponds that we've talked about and the cost for Malloy 2B1 essentially. At the end of 2026, the total in our stormwater reserve would be about $2.3 million.
Sorry to interrupt. Councillor Avery had a follow-up question.
Just to follow up on the Southern Regional Stormwater Project, would it be wrong of us to ask them to contribute to our project as the water flows downhill? We're catching it and containing it uphill, so why are they not contributing the Tabors, MDA Tabors, and those that are downstream from us? We're helping them with their flooding issues, so they should be just as considerate on our end and contributing towards our stormwater projects.
Yeah, that's a good question. That one of those political ones that probably has to work out there. I would maybe defer that to our CAO if he has any comment on that.
I thought you'd never ask. So Councillor Pickering and I, we are the town representatives on that, the steering committee for the funding allocations in the future, and our manager of infrastructure is on the technical discussions with respect to that project. We have looked at different funding formulas. In fact, the most recent discussion with them went through the various different funding formulas that were used to decide who pays what share. And this is one of those formulas where any party could take a stab at arguing a better way to divide up the funding allocation. That's a really good logical argument because they have made assumptions on the scope of their work downstream, assuming that we're going to complete our work upstream. But that's work that we're paying for and not them, and there's only 3 parties, not 10 parties. Very valid question. Trying to come up with a funding share that 12 different communities between Lethbridge and Medicine Hat can agree on is very difficult. And so one of the exercises at the last workshop that I attended is MPE went through, I think, a number of different scenarios. And what was interesting is that regardless of the weighting of the different criteria that was used, the answers didn't differ significantly based on the type of formula that was used. And so my takeaway is that, rather than potentially causing factions with the different partners along the corridor, let's focus on what we have in common. And so one of the the thought processes is why don't we look at coming up with an equal share model, but that would also include the city of Lethbridge and the city of Medicine Hat who aren't currently involved. And if they were to come to the table, could all of the other partners live with an equal share type formula to show sort of a united spirit in an infrastructure asset that's good for our entire region? Because we will debate till our faces are blue on what numeric formula will work best, and I don't think we'll ever get consensus on that. And so one of the options is do we do it the equal share option regardless of the complicated formulas that have been advanced, recognizing that controlling stormwater and also improving irrigation infrastructure, we all benefit from that to some degree. So that's almost a answer from a politician. Sounds I'm being a little political, but I'm trying to summarize the nature of the discussion at the most recent policy subcommittee.
Well, and it's interesting because everything flows into the South Saskatchewan Basin, which runs right through the city of Medicine Hat. So it's interesting that we're catching it and holding it here to prevent floods going east, but there's no contribution. And how many millions has the town of Coaldale spent in the last 10 years into their stormwater management?
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. And did I miss anything, Councillor Pickering?
No, you summed it up very well. It was discussed in lengthy terms, and if, like he says, if the city of Lethbridge and Medicine Hat come on board, that could change a lot for the town of Coaldale.
Kyle, sorry that we stopped you mid-through, so if you could back up and start from that beginning of that slide again, please.
Sure, I may just jump ahead to kind of help with that slide as well. So one of the items that we discussed with council previously is a utility rate structure that is more conducive to user pay system. And when looking at our storm water and the current fees charged, the current system is every utility account. Commercial, residential, regardless of size, currently pays the same monthly flat fee. So what we've done over the summer is kind of an audit of our utility system and split out the commercial, industry, and the commercial versus the residential, and look at the various land sizes there. Because the larger your land size, if you're commercial, you largely have more pavement building, which can create higher risk for runoff, which goes back to the user pay system. And we'll talk about this again further as part of the operating budget, but just a sneak peek for council here. You'll see that there's approximately 3,500 utility accounts in the town of Coaldale. So no surprise, the majority of them are residential, so 3,287, and then the rest, just over 200, being commercial. And we looked at various sizes of land. You can split it, any way you want, but we kind of stuck between the 0 to 1 acre, which was 162 properties, and the over 1 acre size, which was 57 properties. And with obviously the added costs from Malloy and some of the uncertainties associated with funding, top-up funding we may receive, or additional funding we may be received from other projects, as Councillor Avery had noted, there is a need for increased investment in our stormwater and future capital reserve. So what we've done is, again, just kind of played around with some figures. You'll see year-over-year increases that change based on the category presented here. And these figures flow back into kind of this funding chart. So at the top of the chart, it shows the funding coming in. So at the end of 2026, that would be $375,000. That's net after our day-to-day operating expenses for our utility and our town storm. That amount would go to our capital reserves to fund these various projects. So assuming we are successful in additional funding, our stormwater balance after the Malloy 2B1 and the other projects would have reduced from just under $2 million in 2018 to about $1.3 million in 2026. But but I believe there's quite a lot of bang for buck there if we can get the Malloy project done and these other small projects. So this is kind of the concept that we've talked about before, and we're presenting it to council here for the first time. But again, we'll touch base on this further in the operating budget, but it's kind of the funding roadmap we've outlined here is kind of the best case based on the structure of your utility accounts and the future capital required for these projects. Okay, seeing no questions on that, so we'll jump to the next big utility project here, and that's the potable water reservoir. So the estimated project for this, the estimated cost for this project is $11.1 million. We have received just over $250,000 in funding for design. That leaves the remaining cost of $10.6 million. We are applying for the AMWWP grant. Should we be successful in that, the remaining balance for the town would just be over $7 million. And if we're not successful in that, it remains at $10.5 million there as a cost. So talking just kind of on the finance details on this project here, let's assume we are successful in the AMWWP funding. We believe there is a good chance we will, because we did receive the initial design under that current stream. So assuming we are funding successful, that leaves a total cost of the $7 million that needs to be funded. And there's quite a bit to consider as part of this. There's offsite levies that we currently have received. There's our water reserve balance that we have currently, as well as future contributions to that water reserve. In one of the contributions, funding considerations, so offsite levies, there is an estimated $2 million to $3 million that's going to be received through new development for offsite levies for the town of Coaldale in the next 10 years. And it's easy to allocate those funds to this capital project, but one of the challenges with that is that if we're completing a capital project such as the water reservoir that is going to be over the next year or two, we have construction costs coming up over the next year or two. And if we don't have these offsite levy reserves coming in for 10 years, we know about them, but essentially the town has to bridge finance that. So it becomes a question of how much of those future offsite levies do we want to bridge finance, pay interest on it at higher rates right now, and allocate that towards this project, or we kind of suck it up and pay it through our municipal reserves, lack of a better word, and use those offsite levies for future projects down the road. So that is kind of the magic funding formula which we're working towards finding an answer there. A lot of this will be dependent kind of on when we expect development and funding for these offset levies to come in, and how much it will cost to carry those future payments as bridge financing for this project. So again, this project is kind of contingent on funding, but that's where we are right now as far as planning. This still rolls into our sanitary trunk line project as well too, in which it's kind of the same scenario. We do have estimated levies for road and sewer between $5 and $7 million in the next 10 years that could be applied to this project. But what we have to do is kind of map out when we're expecting to receive those funds, and what's the financing cost of allocating funds 10 years down the road to projects now versus allocating them for future projects of need. So this is still an item that administration does need to do a little bit of work on, but we're just bringing it up to council for now. One of the other items to note on the potable water reservoir is that there will be debenture debt required for this, and it could range anywhere from 4.3 to about 1.3 million is what we're anticipating right now. And the way we fund that is essentially taking, we've been increasing the amount that we're putting into our water reserves every year, knowing this is going to happen. and you essentially take the debenture debt payment from that water reserve to fund the capital portion. So not an item that we need consensus on right now, but for example, where council prefers shorter term loans, paying shorter term interest, and paying higher principal payments up front, that again, the offside is that you have less immediate capital for other water needs that may come up, or you could extend the life of the loan, pay higher interest, and you maintain a higher cash flow balance for additional water expenses that may come up. So this is an item that we're going to have to discuss with a little bit further between council administration and kind of map up the next 5 years, 5 to 10 years, just to get a really good roadmap of the best way to fund this to mitigate interest in financing pressures. No questions on that one.
We have a question from Councillor Chapman.
More of a comment. Thank you, Mayor. Just interesting how history seems to repeat itself. When in 2000, I think it was, when we entered an agreement for the Water Commission to build a pipeline out to Coaldale, and a debenture had to be taken out for that. I can't remember how many years that debenture was for. It's since paid off, but to go back into this whole new level of water again for our purposes is inevitable.
Okay, so that's kind of the conclusion of our utility projects there. So the other portion of this, some of these are budget consideration projects. Some of these are just more FYI for council to consider. So first, let's start. I'll go back to the fleet and the facility sections in which we were talking about. We're allocating reserve funds to those accounts every year for the future expenditures that we know we're going to come up. And to Councillor Chapman's previous question on the difference between the fleet and the pathway reserves, these are kind of our other capital reserves in which there's been funds allocated to these in the past, or there's been savings from capital projects that these funds have been put here. So they're on the screen here from the pathway reserve to the electrical, general capital, highway corridor, and the general recreation reserve. So these are funds that the town currently does hold, but we don't allocate any yearly fundings or savings to these accounts. So it's an item that we do have the funds available, but we want to be considerate in that we don't want to spend all the funds without somewhat replenishing them. As once these reserves are spent, unless any future allocations are allocated to them, they're gone. So again, this isn't an item we need kind of discussion on right now. It will be kind of a placeholder for the operating budget as well, but is there another capital interest or priority or project that council feels strongly about, or an item that they want to allocate future funding to kind of help maintain capital reserves for another future project? So of these funds here, there are some expenses allocated to them. This is just kind of a, again, theory or projection based on what we have here. So at the end of this year, the balance is about $4.2 million. As we get to 2026, that is expected to be about $3 million. The large decrease in that is funds from our Northeast Industrial Land Sale Reserve, in which there's debt servicing and future cost for the debenture debt for economic development that were coming from that account. One of the items that has kind of been discussed every year is part of our asset management and the infrastructure deficit that, again, every community in Canada is facing. Coaldale isn't special like this. This is more so kind of information, but it will be easier to have these discussions with the operating budget, and we can kind of see the full picture of the operating budget. But the town does commit $75,000 annually to the road reserve. Historically, this has just been a low number. that we've tried to increase a little bit every year, but again, that somewhat gets offset by other areas of need of pressing capital projects such as the water reservoir and whatnot. So council did allocate $1 million to the road resurfacing program in 2023. Again, these funds did come from the land sale reserve account. So once those funds are fully committed and spent, they are gone unless additional funding is allocated towards them. So this is an item to kind of maybe think of, we can discuss now, or we can hold back for the next meeting, but it's like, what level of service does council want to have as part of the maintenance of our roads in conjunction with our asset management program? So again, I know this can be somewhat sensitive as it's tied to tax increases, but for example, should council want to aim for an annual $1 million, you could get there in 3 years essentially. If you're to put $300,000 a year, year over year. We just put that example on the board because it is kind of consistent with the $1 million we did spend this year. But again, just kind of an example for illustration purposes at the moment.
Thank you, Kyle. We'll let council digest that and bring that up at the next budget meeting.
So this just kind of continues on that topic. So if there are other areas that, you know, we talked about the pathway reserve, which with the projects council has approved, will be fully spent by the end of 2025. So putting this into context, if council had a particular project that they wanted to allocate funding towards every year, so if we, for example, $100,000 increase year over year, what does that get you? So at the end of 10 years, you do have annual funding of $1 million that could be used for a capital project replacement. And in 10 years, you've also accumulated $5.5 million towards that project. So this goes back to the concept of marginal gains, a $100,000 increase year over year. There is a tax increase, but it is you know, relatively small compared to our operating budgets. And when we look at the magnitude of savings that could be accumulated and further invested into our community, again, that does grow in scope if we just take that approach. So again, just kind of more food for thought and consideration here as well. The next project is the land sale reserve, and I wanted to touch base on this because it does relate to another project in the completion of Civic Square and some of the renovations happening there. So once the land sale reserve, we do have some estimated funding commitments. There's approximately $445,000 in uncommitted funds. And previously when we were discussing this item, we were unsure of what the balance in that account would be. We were still waiting for some stuff to come in, but we do have a little more certainty now. And in relation to the council, so the Civic Square project, that was originally provided to council as a means to pay that would be an internal loan and through operational funding such as our MSI operating and our rental income. And we're looking at this balance in the land reserve and how can we, what's a good way to allocate this? And one of the concepts was to originally allocate this to the internal loan for the Northwest land and to help repay that balance. And that's definitely an option. But we'd also have another internal loan that we're considering as well that we do have an option to potentially pay down. That we can use this funds and then use those operational savings for something else in the operational budget. So this is kind of a couple options for council to consider. We can revisit this as part of the operating budget as well. But just again, some new information that we've kind of been able to firm up and provide council some additional options to consider. Moving on to the next internal loan. So I'll just maybe clarify, an internal loan is essentially borrowing funds from ourselves. So back in 2017, when we did purchase the land where the Malloy project is on the north side of the tracks, and where the new school recreation center is. There was internal loan taken out that was used to repay some existing debenture debt, as well as fund that land purchase. As part of the repayment of that internal loan, there's approximately a 25-year repayment schedule, which administration at the time had set up to repay $90,000 a year towards that loan. Council has previously also committed $1 million from the land sale of that Northwest land as part of a matching grant for some stormwater quality upgrades in the area as well. So what we're just doing is we want to show that, obviously if the grant is successful, there is $1 million from that land sale reserve to go towards this project. We still do have the internal loan on the books that we can estimate that will be repaid in 2032. If that grant application is not successful, council does have the option to still proceed with the stormwater quality project. Should there be further discussions on that, council can use those funds as well to repay this internal loan. And what that does give you too is it's fully repaid off in 2025, as well as it does create some operational savings that you could direct towards somewhere else. So this just kind of goes back to the contingency on a couple of grants. And again, further information that council has at their discretion that they can use in the decision-making process as well. So this is just kind of a FYI, food for thought as well. And one of the next projects we have here is our financial management software system. So this essentially is like our Bellamy software that runs all our day-to-day transactions in accounting software. This program dates back to 2012, so it's quite old, and it is nearing its end of life. Service for this will be fully ending in 2026, so the town must transition to a new software. We haven't done any work on research or the estimated costs yet, but that's something we will start. In looking at the cost, there is, our operating cost for this is $65,000 a year. As part of that, we do anticipate that to increase with a new program, as well as there is a cost to transition to a new system. And the cost to transition, we don't know what that would entail. We just kind of piggyback off some other documents. We've seen Lethbridge County list this for $400,000. I don't know the full scope of their project, but again, this is an item that unfortunately is not discretionary and will have to happen. Funding for this cannot be funded through our capital grants as it doesn't meet the definition. But we're looking at options to possibly fund this through operational surplus or some type of operating reserve. So further information will be presented to council part of our next budget meeting. But again, with such a potential high cost, we did want to provide an update to council sooner than later on this as well. Nearing the end here, so the next piece of equipment is this GPS survey equipment. So our current one is nearing its end of life. We are starting to see some technical difficulties in it, and if this piece of equipment does fail and we don't have it available to us during the construction period in the summer, this can create some quite significant inefficiencies. So we are looking at replacing this. You can essentially replace the whole system as a bundle, and with that you save about $7,500. So that reduces the estimated price down to about $40,000 for this piece of equipment, in which we would recommend funding this through our general capital reserve at the moment. And the last project we have to talk about is the dog park accessibility. So at the June 26, 2023 council meeting, council did receive options to increase the accessibility at the dog park ranging from $30,000 to $150,000. Administration is applying for grants for this project, which we're likely to know in mid to early to mid 2024 if we are successful. So the town does have some funding, grant funding unallocated for 2025 that could be designated towards this project. But again, we're still waiting for these amounts to be confirmed. And part of the funding, if we do get grant funding, we may not need to rely on these external grants. So as part of this, we are just kind of recommending to hold tight for now until we do know the status of our grant application, in which we can revisit this in 2024, should council agree. And with that, that's enough for me talking. I'll turn it one last time over to you, Mr. Mayor, for any questions.
Thank you, Kyle, for all your hard work that you put into this with your team. Much appreciated. It was very easy to follow. With that being said, I'll open up to council if there's any follow-up questions for our presenter. Seeing none, then I'm looking for a motion that council receive the 2024 budget deliberations as information. Deputy Mayor Saylor makes that motion. Any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Carried unanimously. Thank you. And that concludes the business portion of today's meeting. So at 7:10 p.m., I'm looking for a motion to adjourn the meeting. Councillor Reese, any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Carried unanimously. Thank you.